The views and opinions on Where Did the Road Go belong to those making them. Do not mistake allowing freedom of speech for agreement. This month's Where Did the Road Go is sponsored by the following amazing individuals: Greg Ross, Bill Illuminati, Allison Cook, Super Inframan, 36 Dingo, and Michael Frisky. Thank you all for helping to make this show possible. And if you'd like to help out, become a patron at wheredidtheroadgo.com. It's only $3 a month for lots of extra content.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Soraya.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight I have back with me Mr. Timothy Renner.
Hey, good to be back.
You've written another book.
I have. This one's taken me quite a while.
Yeah, and it's a little bit different from your other books.
It really is. The research part of it was very different. We can get into that now or later.
Yeah. Well, what's the book, first of all?
It is called I Have Never Minded the Loneliness, Hermits and Their Stories.
How many books does this make for you?
I'm sorry?
How many books does this make for you?
Oh, it depends how you count. Are we counting the ones with cuts?
Yeah, because you wrote a significant amount of those.
All right. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's 7 books that aren't just like art based. I have 2 books that are just basically collections of artwork.
Right.
So 9 total, but 7 I've written.
Nice. Ever imagine you'd be at that point?
No. I may have said this before. Back when I started, I remember reading an article about, like, if you're an independent author, expect to publish 10 books before you can make a living off of it. I don't know who they were talking. It's going to take far more than 10 for me to make a living off of it. And from what I understand, like, most independent authors don't sell that many books. And I don't. I'm not topping the charts, but I think they said the average is 15. I'm doing a lot better than that, but it's going to take more than 10. But I thought at the time, maybe I could do a book every 2 years or something and get out 10. We'll see. This one really, really slowed my progress down. I'm going to try to be a little bit faster in the future, but the research of this one is just a different kind of thing.
And what is this one?
So it's stories about hermits from the 19th and early 20th century.
Okay. And how lengthwise, is it comparable to your early books, or is it longer?
It's longer. It's comparable to Where the Footprints End.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. But this is all me. No help touch on this one.
And I know you traveled around quite a bit looking at some of this stuff.
Yeah, my son and I did what I call a hermit road trip, where we went up to New England and visited some places where these hermits were, and made some local trips as well, and found the Gettysburg Hermit, which was a very, very special one for me.
Okay, what fascinates you about hermits in the first place?
Well, so in the introduction to the book, I kind of go over this a bit, and I think it's a multi-pronged thing. For one, they're liminal people, right? They're kind of outside. They're kind of wild men. They're sort of half wild. Most of them are living in the wild, separate from society. A little bit of there, but for the grace of God go I, because I do have those tendencies. I can very much hermit. Local friends can attest to how hard it is to get me to get out of the house sometimes. Other than for a hike, I'm always down for a hike. But hey, come see my band.
Right.
I'll try. But the other part is there are people, and one of my brothers was one of these people who look upon people like this with disdain. Anyone who's like kind of steps out of line, right?
Yeah.
And lives their life on their own terms, right? And because they look kind of rough and dirty, he would call them losers.
Yeah.
And I started thinking about this. And first of all, I always hated that term. I hate it.
Yeah.
Like, that's, to me, it's one of the most dismissive, just nastiest things you can call somebody. It's such a dismissive term. So, I would really never use that term myself, but it's one he was very fond of,
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this as I was doing. I was like, man, he would call all of these people losers. But the truth is, all those people that just lived a normal life, they're all lost. They didn't do anything outside of the ordinary. They stayed in line. They didn't do anything special. Those are the people that are lost. We don't know anything about them. These hermits, I've found them, over 300 pages, over 30 some hermits in this book. They're found. So, saving them from the old second death, I suppose. That very much appeals to me as well. Like the idea that these were castaways, but these are the people that have made it through time, not the people that just were your average everyday, stay in line, don't do anything unusual people.
That's interesting. I don't. Why are there so many records of hermits?
I think because they were unusual, because they're fascinating to us, right? What makes someone want to do that? To just like step away from society? Like, yeah, I'm done. I'm out. I'm gone, And I think it's very, very fascinating. I think it's always been fascinating to people. And a lot of these, especially back, this is pre-TV, back in the day, they're looking for human interest stories, I think. And if there's a local guy that like, hey, he lives alone, he's, up in that shack up on the side of the mountain there, what's his story, And often they just made up stories. So there's a lot of legends I had to dig through and look, okay, there's the legend, what's the truth? And as best as I could. Sometimes I printed the legend and the truth as best as I could, just because the legends are so cool. But a lot of times you get a lot of the same thing. Oh, he got his heart broken as a young man and couldn't take it and just went off to live by himself. You hear that like trope again and again and again with these guys. And it's not always the case. You start doing some digging and sometimes they tried their luck at different things and they just couldn't do it and decided, hey, I'm going to go off and live in the woods. One of the guys had tuberculosis and couldn't live in the city anymore. And his doctor had prescribed him to go to sea. And he was on his way and kind of stopped in the woods near the coast on Massachusetts and found that the combination of the fresh air in the woods and the salt air was very healthy for him and apparently kind of cured his tuberculosis. Oh. That was Mason Augustus Walton. And there's still a plaque in the park where he was. He had his cabin there.
And did these guys like live off the land, or did they actually go into town now and again?
Most of them had help. Okay. There were a couple who lived so far out that they had to be living off the land. Most of them had help. They would people would take pity on them. They give them food, or they go into town and they give them the stale bread from the bakery and so forth. Yes, Gloucester Forest is renamed Ravenswood Park. Mason Walton lived, and there's still a plaque there near where his cabin was.
That's
so when
cool.
They turned it into a park, that he was still allowed to live there until he died. So, But yeah, he swears his tuberculosis was cured by just sleeping out in the air. So there's various reasons that people have done it, but most of the tropes in the newspaper articles, so I would say 80% will say, oh, he's had his heart broken by his true love, and he went off to the woods to live alone.
Well, sure, because the romanticism sells more.
Yeah. In fact, probably the most popular hermit in here is known as the Old Leather Man, and he was an itinerant hermit. So he lived by himself, but he walked, and he did a circuit through Connecticut and New York and stayed in various caves and lean-to shelters along the way. And at some point, a newspaper printed a story about him. And they said it was called Mystery Solved. And they said that his name was Jules Bourgelat or Bourgelat, and that he was born in France. He did have a French accent, and that he was, he had been engaged to the daughter of a leather merchant. So the leather man, he wore a big, heavy leather suit, a patchwork suit that he sewed together from old leather boots. Winter and summer, he walked around in this big, heavy leather suit.
Wow.
Yeah, and he did this circuit throughout New York and Connecticut, and it took him so long to, so many times to do it. He would keep doing it throughout the year, but he was so regular with it. They said farmers would time the planting of their crops by when the Leatherman showed up. So he was very, very regular with it. Huh. In any case, they come up with a story that he was engaged to this daughter of a leather merchant, and things went wrong, and he ended up coming to America, and he was doing his penance by staying in this leather suit. Complete fiction. Just had nothing to do with the reality of this guy. In fact, his tombstone, up until very recently, had Jules Bourgelat on it. And they exhumed him because up until the 80s, they were printing this leather merchant story like as his life story. But they exhumed him, or they tried to exhume him. They found nothing in the grave.
Oh.
But some old coffin nails. So he probably just returned to the earth. But they wanted to get some DNA to prove who he is, and they got him a new tombstone at the time. His tombstone now just says the Leatherman. So he's one of the few true mysteries out there. A lot of times, you can find stuff on these guys, but there's really very, very little information on him. He didn't talk to many people. He did this circuit. He would stop at a few people's houses who gave him food. He was very kind to children. Like he would sit down and eat lunch with children if they came up to him, but he wouldn't speak to them. He barely ever spoke. When he did spoke, he had a French accent. He might have been French Canadian. He might not have been,
Right.
But that's about all we know. When he died, he had a scapular on and a prayer book, so we know he's Catholic. But other than that, there's not much we know about the guy. So he's a rarity. He really is a true mystery. But he's very popular to this day. There's still a race called the Leatherman race, and several of his caves are known as Leatherman caves. You can go visit, and photos of him are very expensive when you can find them. I have a couple postcards of him, but the actual photos from back in the 1800s. He died in 1889.
Yeah.
Near Sing Sing, New York. He died in one of his caves. He had cancer. But there's just very little information on him as a person. But there's several photos were taken of him, some without his knowledge and a couple with his knowledge. And those are very expensive when they come up. I've seen a few come around, but I own one of the postcards, not the original photos.
Wasn't photography pretty damn hard at that point?
Yeah, especially in like 1880s. There weren't a lot of people who were, they had photographer studios, but there weren't a lot of people who were taking their cameras out, to photograph these guys. Now there were some, and most every hermit in this book. That's the other thing. The way I had to narrow it down, there were so many hermits. Like, so when I started this book, I was like, well, who do I want to write about? How do I narrow it down? There's so many hermits out there, way more than you'd ever think. I said, well, I have to narrow this down some way, or it's going to be, 3 times the size of Ecology of Souls when I'm done. 9 volumes of Hermits or whatever.
Right.
So the way I got into hermits is my wife, Allison, had bought me a picture of one particular hermit. His name was William Woodruff from Connecticut. And she just said, hey, you like wild man? This guy looks like a wild man. And just gave it to me one day. And I set it on my desk by my computer, and it got buried in other papers and stuff, and things I wanted to work on for the podcast or other research I was doing, et cetera, et cetera. And one day it just kind of shuffled to the surface, and I had a few minutes. I said, it had this name on it. It said, Billy Woodruff from Cold Brick River, Connecticut. I'm going to type in it, see what this guy's about, see if I can find anything about this guy. And these articles started popping up, and this guy was super fascinating, really, really fascinating. And that's what kind of got me hooked on this. I was like, man, this guy had a really interesting life. So from there, I started collecting photos of these hermits, photo postcards and actual photos, old cabinet cards and stereo view photos from the 1800s. The photo postcard comes in about 1904. It really gets popular around 1907. And a lot of these guys were subjects of photo postcards, what they call the real photo postcard. They were actual photographs made into postcards. So that's how I narrowed down who to write about. Well, I'm going to take my photo collection. I'm going to write about those hermits. So almost every hermit in the book, there are a few exceptions, but almost every hermit I write about, you get to see their photo. You get to see what they look like. And many of them have multiple photos in there.
Nice. What kind of equipment did they have for photography back then? Was it just the plate thing?
This would be an Allison question. To the best of my knowledge, so they would have had glass plate negatives in the 1880s, I think, is what they would have been doing. And we're at paper photography at that point. So before then, if you've seen what they call tin types, they're actually on little pieces of rolled iron. They rust. They're really cool looking. Those are my favorites. Just really neat looking. They print them on metal. Before that, there was amber types, and that's a process on glass that has a black, you put a black mat or you paint the back of the glass black. Actually looks like a negative until you put the black on, then it becomes a positive. It's a very interesting process. And before that, there would have been daguerreotypes, which almost look like mirrors with photos printed on them. Really, then daguerreotype photos are incredibly detailed. Like if you think of old photography being nowhere near as good as modern, those old daguerreotypes, some of them are absolutely beautiful. The details are astounding in them. It's only when they went to paper photography that they started losing some of those details and stuff. Some of those old daguerreotypes are fascinating. The ones that survive, they actually can rot away. They're very fragile. You can rub them off with your skin, like with your fingers rather. Just touching them, you can rub the image away.
Oh wow!
So, yeah. So those are the ones that are in like cases. Like if you've seen them in antique stores and stuff, they're like probably a daguerreotype, amber type. Sometimes they'll put tin types in cases, but those were direct processes. So the photograph would have been right on the medium for those. So they would go right on the it's like a silver plate for daguerreotype. It would go right onto the silver plate, so no negative for that. It's a once and done, thing. Same with tintypes and ambrotypes. For paper photography, they started having the glass negatives. So then they would have negatives. So they could print more than one copy of things. On up until once they hit, around 1900 or so, people started getting their own cameras. And this like real photo postcard is a silver gelatin process. So they would have had a little bit more portability, and the cameras would have gotten a little smaller. So I think that's why you start getting more and more of these outside shots, and all the hermits, not all of them, a lot of the hermits are in the photo postcard era.
So were these people that I mean, obviously you said these people were often looked down on, but like did they also hold a fascination for the public?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Newspapers are filled with stories of these guys and women. There's a few women in the book too, and not every sometimes they were kind of made fun of, but often they became like folk heroes, sometimes they were George Washington Gilbert from Connecticut. He was known as the barefoot hermit, and they said they would judge the weather based on how long he went barefoot. So if he went barefoot to November, it would be a mild winter. But if he put his shoes on before November, they said it was going to be a hard winter. So he was, sort of like beloved by the community, and a lot of these guys would be taken care of, and the kind of community sort of adopted them as like one of their own. There was one on Long Island who was really such a tourist attraction when people came to Long Island, that, for vacations out on I think it was Far Rockaway where he was, that he was worth taking care of by the community, because so many people would come there and they would want to see an actual hermit, when they were on vacation and so forth. That the community, when he was having hard times, the community really reached out and took care of him and started, making sure he had a nicer shack. They built him a nicer shack. He was living in a really run down place. They made sure he had food, and they would check in on him pretty regularly, which was very nice.
Yeah.
But he was valuable to them. He was a tourist attraction.
Yeah. What are most of these hermits you wrote about in the Northeast?
Yes, and that's not on I didn't just focus on that area. I have a hermit from Brittany in there. I've got quite a few from the UK. Some from the South, some from out West, but the majority are in New England. And I do not know why that is. I don't know whether that's just because the newspapers reported on them more there. You would think they'd go to a warmer environment, right?
Yeah.
But most of them, a good percentage are in New England.
Yeah, I would definitely think if you're going to be living like that, you'd want to live somewhere where it was temperate.
Yeah.
Not that cold in the winter, and, you can deal with the heat in the summer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. They're the vast majority of them, I would say 70% or more, are from New England.
Wow.
So, those in my book,
When you went on the trip, what were you like? What could you find on the trip that you weren't able to find online?
So I didn't know, and earlier that year, I had found out there was a hermit in Gettysburg, and he's one of my favorites. My favorite became John Stink, which we can talk about too. He's John Stink's very, very interesting, but one of my favorites is the Gettysburg hermit, and I do not have his photograph. He's one of the few in the book that I could not source a photograph for him. But when I found out there was a photograph, when I found out there was a hermit so nearby, I got to find this guy. And an old newspaper article said he lived on the most remote part of the battlefield on a place called Wolf Hill. So I started doing research. Okay, looking at old maps. I have to be able to find this guy. He lived in a cave, and then he built a cabin. And I thought, I got to be able to find this. There's got to be remnants of this up there somewhere. It turns out Wolf Hill is what they call now the Lost Avenue in Gettysburg. It is the most remote and hardest to get to place on the national battlefield.
Wow.
So we were taking maps from the 1800s. He was there from 1890 something into the early 1900s, very early 1900s. And I'm looking at these old maps. I'm looking for anything, because a lot of times they would mark things on the map, houses, residences, and so forth. And I'm looking on Wolf Hill there, and I'm not really seeing anything. There was a couple of little squares that might have been little tiny houses. I'm just not finding anything. And John, John Darby.
Yeah.
John overlaid the old maps over a Google satellite image so we could look at it better. And we're looking at it, and we had a couple good candidates of areas to look. So we go over there, and the Lost Avenue is really odd. It is part of the national battlefield, but to get to it, you're not really sure if you're trespassing. You're not really sure if you're allowed to park where you're allowed to park. You basically drive back into this residential area, rural residential area. It's not like a neighborhood. It's quite rural, but there are houses around, and you just kind of get to the end of the road and park, and then you walk this trail down to the creek, and it's not a well-maintained trail. You're thinking like, National Battlefield, this is going to be a nice, it's not a well-maintained trail at all. So you're not really sure you're in the right place until you get down to the creek. And I think there's a little sign that points you up to, they call it the Lost Avenue. And up we went, and we're looking around for most of the day. We're looking for any sign, like where could this guy build his cabin? Where could it be? No, maybe this is a good idea. There's no photos. There was a drawing of his cave in one newspaper. It wasn't a very detailed drawing. It wasn't very good. And I was like, well, maybe we can find the cave. We're looking all around, and we spent most of the day there. And we're literally leaving. This is in February of 22, I think. And we're getting ready to leave. It's a pretty warm day in February. It's not super cold. And I said out loud, okay, Herman, if you're going to show us something, now's the time, because we got to leave. And 30 seconds later, I was recording for Strange Familiars. You can, it's probably less than 30 seconds. You can actually time it. You can hear it real time in the episode I did. I looked over to the left, and in a field, I saw this little this indentation in the ground. It wasn't super little, but it was, like a 10 by 10 kind of indentation in the ground. And I said, John, look at that. So that looks like it could be like a foundation kind of area. And he says, it sure does. So we walked over to this, and sure enough, it looked like the foundation of a, what could have been a cabin. And there was one detail in the article. It said he had a hand-dug well that was right by his cabin. And I said to John, I was like, well, there's no way of knowing unless we find that well. And I swear to you, I looked over to the left again, and there's a well. And it was a hand-dug well, still had water in it.
Wow.
Yeah, over 100 years later. And I was like, well, this is it. We found the place. This is his place. Super happy. I was super excited about it. Go back and I tell Chad, hey, we found the Gettysburg Hermit. We found his home. And Chad immediately said, after the Gettysburg Hermit had hanged himself, okay. He was possibly disturbed. He was saying that neighbors were messing with him, and they had killed his cat. And he actually said he was going to cast a spell on him. He may have been a powwow doctor. He may have been, he was German and moved here. So he may have been doing some kind of folk magic, because they found around his place after he had hanged himself all these notes that said in hoc signo vinces in Latin, which was like, in his name we shall conquer. And some notes about his neighbors, like tormenting him and stuff. So it sounded like he was making good on he had gone to the police and said, if you don't do something, I'm going to cast a spell on and hypnotize these neighbors that are bothering. So it sounds like he was making good and trying to do some sort of, powwow or folk magic there with that, because they found that in Latin written all over his cabin on scraps of paper and stuff. In any case, he hanged himself. People found him a little while later. And some years after that, like itinerants were staying in his cabin, but they said nobody would stay long because it was haunted. He said like they would hear strange sounds, and like his ghost roamed the hills there and so forth. And it burnt down. Eventually, the cabin burnt down some years later. So I'm telling Chad, like, hey, I found this cabin. And he says, well, did you check for carbon? I'm like, no, I didn't. He's like, well, you might not have the right cabin. I was like, no, Chad, there's a well right beside it. Just like the newspaper article says, I'm certain this is the place. And he says, well, we got to go back there and check. Okay. So we go back there, and I show him where it was, and he digs down, and immediately we found carbon. Like, so when wood burns, that evidence is there for like pretty much forever. You can find that. It doesn't go away. So he dug down a little bit and was like, oh yeah, this is carbon. There was a fire here. This burnt down. So then he was confident that we did find the right place. And then he says to me, did you find his cave? And I said, no, we looked for it, but we didn't find it. And Chad said, well, let's check up here. And we went just beyond where John and I had checked, just a little bit up higher on the hill. And it looked like boulders. There were like some boulders there. And I walked around the side of the boulders, and it's not, I mean, I can see why they would call it a cave in the newspaper articles. It's more like a stone chamber that was formed by these boulders kind of laying on top of each other. And we went inside of that. Absolutely, one person could absolutely live in there. There was stone stacked up to block the air, the cracks in the boulder and stuff to block the air. And I went around the back side, and I found a little chimney he had made on it. So all of that is still there. And so we found his cave too. And that was such a neat feeling to find this stuff, because nobody cares about, like, I've gone to the Historical Society in Gettysburg, and I've talked to them about this hermit. They don't care. It's not the Civil War. Like, the Civil War is king there. They only want history of the Civil War, So this guy is completely forgotten. To me, he's a super interesting guy. They said he was the best marksman in Pennsylvania with a bow and arrow. He would hunt for his food with a bow and arrow. A super fascinating guy. And they just don't care. Because I thought, well, maybe they have a photo of, and they hadn't even heard of him. And to me, I'm just like, this is incredible. I found where this guy was. I found his cave. Like, this is where he lived. And I was so excited by it that I thought, I want to do more of this, right? So I I wanted to go find that original hermit that Allison had given me the card for, William Woodruff, up in Colebrook River, Connecticut. And there's another hermit in Athol, Massachusetts, or Irving, Massachusetts. He lived in a cave. And I knew that cave you could visit it because one of my listeners had already been there and told me. So, I knew I could get to that cave, but I thought on the way up, I'm going to look for William Woodruff's cabin. So we stopped in Connecticut first. And I was also going to try to find some Leatherman caves, but the weather it didn't cooperate with us. It was so hot. We went in August. It was unbelievably hot. Colebrook River, the town that William Woodruff lived outside, it was now underwater. It's under a reservoir.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but he lived on what's called Woodruff Hill. And I thought, well, maybe I get there, I can find the hill, and I could figure out where his cabin was. His cabin burned down too, but I might be able to find, some evidence of it. We got there, and I think it was probably like 104 that day or something. It was so unbelievably hot. And I went to the reservoir where, that Colebrook River is now underneath of the town of Colebrook River. And I'm looking all around, and there's hills on every side. And I thought, and they're just covered in woods. And I just thought, I'm not going to be able to find this cabin, not in a day. I'll need a week, to look for this. So instead, I went and found his grave. And he was known for, he had taken a vow of silence, William Woodruff, after his sweetheart said she wouldn't marry him. And this may not be true. It's hard to tell. But supposedly he took a vow of silence, and he planted hollyhocks all around his cabin, which were her favorite flower. And he would give them out to people when they passed by his cabin. He would hand them these hollyhock flowers. So what I did was I found his grave, and I planted hollyhocks on his grave.
Nice.
Yeah. So, and then we proceeded up to Athol and Irving, and spent some days there, and found Irving, what they call Irving Castle, what the hermit called Irving Castle, which was his cave in the woods.
Huh. So when they had a cave, was it how deep did these caves normally go?
It depended on the hermit. Now, so the hermit of Irving Castle, his name was John Smith, and we do not know if that was his real name or not. He was absolutely with it enough to possibly change his name to that, to be anonymous. He really didn't want too much of his history to be found out, except that which he told. So John Smith may or may not be his real name, but he was known as John Smith, the hermit of Irving Castle. He found a cave. He came from Scotland. Now, he was what's known as an ornamental hermit in Scotland, which these were, so your rich lords and ladies. It was of the fashion from about, the 1600s through the 1800s to have a hermit living on your land. It was a very fashionable thing. If you were, if you were wealthy enough, you had your own hermit. So it was a job you could have. You could be an ornamental hermit. They would hire you for a period of time. You would sign a contract, and they would have stipulations in the contract. You cannot cut your hair. You cannot cut your nails. You must live in this, if they had a cave on their property, or sometimes they build them a little hut or something, you must live there. You can only read religious matter, whatever it is. They would enter into this, contract and live as a hermit. Basically, that would be their job. So he was an ornamental hermit for several lords and ladies in Scotland before coming to America. He came to America, went to New York for a while, ended up in Boston. There was a small Scottish population up there. He knew some people up there, and eventually went out to not far western Massachusetts, but out to kind of like the Five Colleges area, the Athol and Northampton kind of area, and found a cave. And he said he didn't know if he was going to be allowed to stay there or not. He was living there for several months before the owner of the property found him and just said, "Yeah, you can stay here. I don't care." Back in the 1800s, I guess people didn't worry about getting sued or anything. So, and he became quite popular. Once people found out, people would go visit him on the weekends. He would sell photographs of himself, and he would knit stockings. He would sell them, and he picked various, wild fruits and berries and so forth, and sell them as well. But most of his living he made from selling photographs of himself, and he had written a biography of himself that he would sell as well.
Were you able to find that?
Yes. And it's very interesting. It definitely reads. I think you're reading what he wants you to know. In the biography, and there may be some self-aggrandizing in there, some of his own legends, but it's very interesting because he was an actor and this ornamental hermit, and had some run-ins with some pretty mean characters over there before he came to America.
And why would someone want a ornamental hermit?
It was a status symbol for these lords and ladies. If you had a hermit living on your land, it was like a status symbol.
That's bizarre.
Yeah, there was actually a book published in the 16 or 1700s, basically for these lords and ladies, to give them ideas of structures to build in which their hermits could live.
It's like having a pet.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Man, what were most of these hermits religious?
No.
Okay.
There are some religious hermits in the book. Now some of them had religion, you know what I mean, but they weren't like. There's one priest, and it's Father Oray, and he's from Brittany. I'm very, very bad with French, so. But he was a priest that lost his hearing and ended up on the coast of Brittany, and he ended up for 10 years just carving the rocks there. And It's a place called, and I'm sorry to anyone who speaks French or lives in Brittany, I'm going to butcher this. I think it's Rotneuf, the town where he lived. And you can still see the carvings there today, although they are being eroded by the weather and so forth. And to the point where that town actually doesn't encourage people to come there because they're afraid too much tourism will damage the rocks and so forth. But he carved a massive amount of rocks, some of them religious scenes, some of them like local folklore scenes, just for 10 years. He carved and carved and carved. And it's quite an amazing thing that he did there.
Wow.
But he's the only professional religious I have in the book.
Well, you mentioned the other guy was Catholic.
And and there are a few other folks who had religion certainly, but they weren't like their profession wasn't as a religious as a priest.
Okay. All right.
There are plenty of those hermits, and that would be another book. And it's a fascinating book as well. Starting with the Desert Fathers and so forth. That basically inspired what we now know as monks today. Started with them. But that's not this book. This book is definitely like character studies of these different kind of hermits.
So what? Obviously, the story, as you said, is usually mythology that romanticized that they were looking, brokenhearted and stuff. What were some of the reasons you found that these people became hermits?
Sometimes they were wanted by the law. Sometimes they, I do believe there's a good few of them that were probably suffering from PTSD after the Civil War.
Oh, that makes sense.
And they just tapped out and said, we're done. We're out of here. In fact, the Hermit of Irving Castle, it's very sad. He had built this cave up for years. By the way, he had enlarged that cave, to answer your question before. It wasn't that deep, and he would heat water and throw it on the rocks, and they would crack, and he would kind of chisel them and made the cave bigger and bigger. But he also built kind of a front structure on the cave as well. You can see in the photos. But later in his life, this other, I guess you could call him another hermit, but he was a Confederate veteran, came, and he was such a mean jerk that he ran John Smith out of the cave. And they said, and I can only imagine this is PTSD, they said he would just take his revolvers and fire into the night. He would just open his window and door and just in the middle of the night, just start firing his guns. Seemed like he was a very, very unpleasant man. But he drove John Smith out of the cave, and John Smith spent his last years living in a sort of a shack a little bit down the mountain from where the cave was. But there's some of the other guys were definitely Civil War veterans that I think were probably PTSD played a role in this because they just tapped out. They wouldn't talk about it much.
Understandable.
Yeah.
So you already talked about the Gettysburg one. Did you talk about the other one that was your favorite?
No, John Stink. So John Stink, I had gotten a photo of him just because it was a hermit. It said Hermit John Stink. I knew he was Native American. Didn't know much else about him. I just had this postcard. It was him with his dog. And at some point I said, well, let me look up John Stink. He was known as the living ghost. So John Stink died supposedly at least once and came back to life. And depending on it, he might have been as many as 3 times. And the really interesting thing is I found umpteen stories about the way he supposedly died. And I make a note in here. So he was Osage Indian. And I do want to be respectful to Osage beliefs and culture. These stories were taken from newspapers at the time. Most of them were, white owned and white ran. I don't know how much to this is, the actual beliefs and behaviors of the Osage, or how much is just attributed to them. But these are the ways, according to the different newspapers, the different ways that John Stink died. In 1906, the Lawton News Republican reported that Hotomoe, that was his Indian name, John Stink's Indian name was Hotomoe, had been afflicted with some sort of disease and was so rapidly emaciated that his friends declared that he could not live. He was pronounced dead and was buried in a shallow grave outside of town. He regained consciousness the same evening and returned to town, frightening the people almost into a panic. Another article from 1906, printed in the Muskogee Daily Phoenix and Times Democrat, gives no name to the illness that afflicted John Stink, but reportedly, John was buried for dead. Before the medicine man had completed his ceremonies, John sat up, rubbed his eyes, and spoke. The Indians fled in terror from the grave, and John was obliged to crawl to the home of a white settler to get food with which to nourish his body back to its normal strength. That was a quote from the paper. The Fort Worth Record and Register reported in 1906 that it was pneumonia which made Hotemawe ill, and after suffering for 2 weeks, he entered a comatose state and was assumed dead. He was interred in a, quote, old burial ground not far from Pawhuska, this is Oklahoma, but awoke and returned to the settlement not long after the funeral party. In 1907, the Coffeyville Daily Journal reported that he had been dead for 3 days before he returned. A tribal council was called to decide the fate of Hotemawe. They decided that the man was dead and an evil spirit had reanimated his corpse. The Ponca City Daily Courier reported in 1908 that Hotemawe had apparently died 3 different times during the last 3 years. They report on his burial in a stone house, but it is unclear if they mean he was buried and returned each time he died. Another article said he was found drunk by the roadside many years ago and presumed dead. That was from the Daily Armorite in 1914. The Wichita Beacon stated in an article printed in 1914 that his apparent death was the result of a savage beating at the hands of Osage law officers. The Wichita Eagle, on the other hand, reported in 1919 that a siege of fever had left him comatose, and he was pronounced dead by tribal medicine men. They continued, quote, he was buried on one of the Indian burial racks, but recovered sufficiently to disentangle himself from the shroud. He found himself an outcast from the tribe, shunned and hooted at, unquote. In 1919, the Morning Tulsa Daily World stated that Hotemawe had been a chieftain that led his warriors in a battle with the Creeks. He was, quote, wounded and stunned and was buried according to custom beneath a pile of rocks, having been judged dead. 3 days later, being a man of great strength, he regained consciousness, threw off his rocky grave, and returned to the tribe, unquote. He was refused admittance to the camp and barred from associating with his people. In a syndicated article published in multiple newspapers in 1926, NEA service writer Bruce Catton noted that it was, quote, white mule or moonshine whiskey which left Hotemawe in a comatose state. After imbibing too much of the beverage, he could not be revived and was pronounced dead by a caucus of elders, and a funeral was organized. Hotemawe was then carried to a barren hill, placed in sitting position in the lee of a huge rock, and gently covered with smaller stones, brush, and the like. The following morning, he awoke with a throbbing hangover, extricated himself from the rock burial, and headed home. The Daily Oklahoma reported in 1932 that he had contracted tuberculosis in the 1890s. His friends found him cold and stiff, thought him dead, placed him on a hillside with his shield and medicine mysteries under his head and bow and trophies at his side. That was a quote. They covered him with rocks, but he awoke from this false death, exhumed himself, and returned to the world of the living. An article published in the Kansas City Star in 1938 stated that it was smallpox which left Hotemawe in a death-like coma. Assuming he had passed, his friends and relatives carried him to the woods, returned to the village, and divided his property amongst themselves. Author Kenneth Jacob Jump, in his biography, The Legend of John Stink, reported that Hotemawe, who had established a campsite near the Sisters of Loretto Catholic School, had been found, quote, apparently frozen to death, unquote, at his camp. Jump asserts that it was likely that the hermit buried himself in the snow to try to preserve as much body heat as he could when his shelter proved inadequate protection from the frigid temperatures during a snowstorm. And finally, probably describing the same incident, the Pawhuska Guide website notes that he was found in the snowbank unconscious by nuns from the Sisters of Loretto Catholic School. He was thought to have frozen to death, but revived a short time later. In almost every version of the story, the returning Hotemawe is met with revulsion from his people, as the dead are meant to stay dead. Stumbling back to the village, dazed and haggard, Hotemawe states, I'm alive. They reply, no, John Stink. In other words, they renamed him John Stink. The newspapers from that time assert that the Osage looked upon John Stink as an evil spirit. Hotemawe had been buried. The renamed John Stink is forced to live an isolated life away from his people. How much of this is true? I do not know. He was a hermit for sure. He became incredibly wealthy. There was a oil strike on Osage land, and the Osage people in the early 1900s, around in the teens in the 1920s, I think, were per capita the richest people in the world.
Wow.
So he ends up with a lot of money. They build him a house. He refuses to stay in the house. He says the white people's house makes me sick. He still lives outside. He had several dogs, a whole pack of dogs that stayed with him. And he would go to the town of Pawhuska and get what he needed, there. And often he would just sleep on the streets. I have photos of him just laying on the street.
Wow.
There. But eventually there's a rabies outbreak in Pawhuska. And they actually made a declaration in the newspaper. It said all animals have to be, all dogs in Pawhuska have to be muzzled, except John Stink's dogs. They knew him so well, and his dogs were so well behaved that they actually made an exception for him. His dogs do not have to be muzzled. Well, at some point, a local marshal, and I just cannot believe he did not know, like this guy, everybody knew John Stink around there. shoots all of his dogs. And the marshal claimed that he thought John Stink was being attacked. And John Stink then leaves Pawhuska, and he refuses to return. So I will never return to this town. He does return, I think, once in his life, but other than that, he kept to it. He never returned. He lived outside of town for the rest of the time. Ended up getting more dogs over time, but he was really heartbroken by that. Really quite a sad story. But so he lived, and he finally died for real in 1938. He fell and broke his leg. He was 75 years old at the time, and he developed pneumonia, and he passed on September 16th, 1938. He's buried in a mausoleum in Pawhuska. They said where only the richest people are buried. So he had quite a lot of money, and he was buried with his cigar in one hand. He loved cigars, and his rosary in the other. He was very generous. They said he gave money to all different churches, like any church in the area. He was almost completely responsible for building the American Legion hut for the Pawhuska veterans, and paid for tuition for a lot of Osage girls to go to school. So, he liked being alone. He set up, on his property, he had a high barbed wire fence, and there's several photos of him standing at his fence. Big man. He was like 6 feet tall, very powerful build, knife on his hip, very imposing looking guy. But he kept to himself and seems to have been a really nice guy. Like, donated a bunch of money, and So I do not know how much of his story is myth or not, but I absolutely love it. I just think it's this fantastic story of this guy who just death couldn't get him. He keeps coming back.
Yeah, absolutely. Huh.
And he was known as the living ghost.
How much paranormal stuff do you find associated with the Hermits?
There's a little bit. So, believe it or not, there's not a story of John Stink's ghost, but they say that his dogs can still be heard howling around the hills. There was a woman named Alice Grace. She lived in England, and she actually lived in a bacon box. She made her home in a big old, like an old crate, and she told fortunes. She would tell fortunes for, trying to find it. It wasn't much. It was like a pittance. She would tell your fortune. A couple of these guys told fortunes. Some of them were well-known weather prophets. There are some ghosts involved. And my favorite is William Woodruff. So the original hermit, the one that I said that Allison bought me the photo of, original to me. He was mistaken for Bigfoot. So at the time, they were having this Wildman flap at the next town over. That was, and I'm going to draw a blank on the town. I will find it here. It starts with a W. Winstead. Then they called it the Winstead Wildman, and it was quite an interesting flap they were having. One of the accounts has a whole carriage full of people shooting at this Wildman to no effect. So, bulletproof Bigfoot.
Right.
Several encounters with them, some very aggressive, chasing guys through the woods and so forth. But one of these, I find this William Woodruff story, and then I find this Winstead Wildman story while I'm doing it, and I did not know they would be connected. But in one of these Wildman stories, they're talking about this area outside of Coldbrook River. The road between Winstead and Coldbrook River went right by William Woodruff's cabin. So I'm 99% sure it was him. And they said this guy, in these old ragged clothes, stepped out of the woods and scared the heck out of people because they thought it was the Winstead Wildman. And given the location, I'm almost certain it was William Woodruff. So he was mistaken for a Bigfoot. So, ties in with my other books for sure.
Huh. Yeah, I was going to ask you if there were wild man and hermit and Bigfoot connections.
That's the most explicit one for sure.
Okay.
Some of the others, and he had another, depending on how Bigfoot conspiracy you want to get, he had a telescope and he would watch the stars. And one night he said a bear chased him into his house. But the interesting thing about that is he said the bear stayed outside the door all night long. That to me, I don't know if that's bear behavior or not.
Yeah.
And he went out and he said he flagged down the stagecoach driver and got him to buy him some shells for his gun and bring them back to him. And he said he showed the stagecoach driver the tracks, which the stagecoach drivers agreed they were bear tracks. But if you want to get real Bigfooty about it, you can say, oh, that sounds odd. Something like just sitting outside the door all night.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It reminds me of I have a documentary of them searching for Bigfoot in China. And one of the guys who was the searchers was this tall guy, I think from the UK, with a beard, and he was very, hairy and stuff. And he was bathing down by the river. And so they then got reports like from the next town over saying the Bigfoot was seen by the river yesterday. And like as he starts looking at the report, he's like, "Oh, that was me. I was bathing." Because they weren't used to seeing these really tall white guys bathing in their river. They thought, wild man.
Yeah. Yeah. One of these guys claimed to have kind of powers. He said that he could tell, and again, you could go to a sinister place with this if you wanted to. He said he could find people missing in the woods, and he lived outside of Manchester, New Hampshire. And the way he could do that is he just concentrate. And he said, this is a quote from me. He said, all I have to do is wait until it's dark, and then my power comes to me. But he said he would know whether they were dead or not before he would even search for them. And like, if you really wanted to get dark, he could maybe go, like, maybe he was killing people. But
oh, yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know that he otherwise seems like an interesting sort of nice guy. He was a poet and, lived by himself for several years. He came from England. His name was Charles Lambert. And but he did claim to have those powers where he could find people in the woods. And he said he could tell whether they were dead or not because he could see in his head whether their blood was black or not. And he said if their blood was black, they were dead.
Well, it sounds like a lot of these guys were actually pretty nice people.
Yeah, for the most part, they seem to be, very kind. They just wanted to live alone. And a lot of them, despite their best efforts, like the Hermit of Irving Castle, I mean, he probably was alone most of the week, but his weekends were filled with visitors. Like they said, hundreds of people would come and they'd have picnics at his cave, and they wanted to get their picture taken with him, or they'd buy his pictures, they'd buy his biography. He just became this real curiosity where people would, absolutely go to visit him. So he's like, he's a hermit, but he can't be left alone. There are a few who were real, like there's a fellow named Erastus Hall. He was from Kentucky, and he became a hermit, and nobody saw him again, supposedly for many, many years. Many years. He was engaged to be married, and the woman he was engaged to died, and he just said, well, I'm out, and he became a hermit. Now, he lived on his parents' plantation, and after the Civil War, one of the formerly enslaved people chose to stay there, this man named Uncle Henry. And Uncle Henry kind of handled the business of the farm on the day-to-day, which kind of allowed him to sort of, be completely solitary. So he didn't see anyone for the rest of his life other than this Uncle Henry, and no one saw him.
Wow.
Yeah. So he was, a true, kind of isolated guy. And some of them were quite isolated by their location. There's a fellow named Adolf Hofer, and I believe he was 18 miles. Yeah, he was 18 miles from the nearest town, which was Waldo, California. He was out in the Siskiyou Mountains, and he doesn't look 100 years old in the photo I have of him, but they claimed he was 100 years old. And like, this is a press photo that went with the article that said he was 100 years old. Again, he may have been, writing his own story there, just telling people he was 100. But
yeah,
he lived so far away, but apparently he was still very, very gracious. When the people did come to him, he'd give them a place to stay and feed them, and was, loved having conversations with people. He just chose to live alone.
Do you think, I mean, it doesn't seem like any of these guys would have actually been lonely.
Well, the quote comes from, there's a fellow in England. His name was Theodore Lamb, and he's really interesting. He's a little bit later than the other guys. So he dies in 1950. He lived on into the 1900s a bit. The photos of him, he looks like your average crust punk today. He's got dreadlocks. He's wearing like old military clothes. They're all torn up. He's got like shoes cut into sandals. So he just cut the front out of them or cut into sandals. I mean, he really looks like he could be in like any crust punk band today. And they asked him, so there was a story going around, as they do, that it was lost love and he was brokenhearted, and that drove him to seclusion. And he said, he laughed. The newspaper reporter said he laughed at this. He said, no, I've never been crossed in love. When I was a youngster, I used to like girls, but I learned the stupidity of it all. I'm not a woman hater. I just don't believe in marriage. That's all. I have a happy life, and I've never minded the loneliness. That's where the title of the book comes. So I think some of these people really just wanted to live alone.
Yeah. Interesting. We got to take a break. We'll be right back. Quick break right here. Some contact info and a recommendation. So everything you can possibly want from Where Did the Road Go can be found on the website, wheredidtheroadgo.com. It has links to all our social media, all the shows all the way back to the beginning, all kinds of stuff there. I mean, it's a ridiculous amount of stuff on that website. So, and if you want to become a patron and get extra stuff, it's only $3 a month. It helps out the show greatly. And just click on the big Patreon link. All right, as for a recommendation, I'm going to go with another thing you can find on Apple TV. I read this review of this. I started to read an article on this movie and how someone thought it sucked, and how Apple did great TV shows and crappy movies. And I would agree that Apple TV has great TV shows. I don't know how many Apple TV movies I've seen. I saw The Instigators, and that was all right. Pretty predictable, but it was fun for what it was. But then he's talking about a movie called The Gorge. And I didn't read any more. I just went and watched it because the concept sounded interesting. And basically, like, the beginning and end of it are a romance. But it's also a little bit of espionage. And in the middle is this sort of sci-fi horror video game-esque action movie. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. So that's my recommendation. Check that out on Apple TV, The Gorge. And now back to the show. You're listening to Where Did the Road Go? And I have Timothy Renner back. And we're talking about his book on hermits, which is called
I Have Never Minded the Loneliness, Hermits and Their Stories.
So how is researching this different than researching like the Bigfoot stuff?
It's way harder, like miles harder, way harder. So these are real people. They were born on a certain date. They died on a certain date. They lived in a certain place. They died in a certain place. There are facts of their lives. And while there are legends printed, I did my best to find the truth on them. Now, I didn't always, and probably what ends up, most of their stories end up being, as much truth as I could find with, some of the legend in there too, to fill out the details, right?
Yeah.
But I did my best where I could to find the details. And I debunk a lot of stuff. A lot of these guys made claims that just weren't true. I think there are two different hermits claim to be the drummer boy of Shiloh, which is a very famous Civil War story, and neither one of them could have been. One was too old, the other wasn't stationed anywhere near that, and I think he was in the Navy anyway. They didn't have drummer boys in the Navy. But in any case, it takes a long time. It takes a really, really long time. So I can find these guys pretty quickly, but then we look for them in the census record, and then so we got to look. Some of the census records are there, some are not. Thankfully, Allison took care of most of that for me. She's very, very good with that side of things. You find their birth certificate. If they came to America, we can sometimes find, when they were naturalized or even sometimes which ship they came on. And you start finding like the real details of their lives. So you find everything you can, but you really don't know the point where you found everything. And that's the hardest part to determine, like, have I found everything I could on this guy?
Yeah.
Like, is that it? So with Bigfoot, and my gosh, I love Bigfoot. And I have plans to write more books on Bigfoot. I have not abandoned the paranormal. Plenty more paranormal books in me yet, but it's a different kind of research. So you kind of, you find these different accounts and you can kind of compare and contrast and come up with your own theories or sort of, put these theories together. Maybe you heard something on Where Did the Road Go? And you find some accounts. It's like, hey, this kind of supports that, right?
Yeah.
It's a different kind of research. It's much, much harder when you're trying to get, the facts down about these people's lives.
And I assume a lot of this stuff probably isn't digitized.
No. So there's historical societies around the country can help you with some of it. Some of it's in newspapers, some of it's in old books. Some of it I was just lucky to come across. And again, with the newspaper articles, you have to be careful because a lot of times, they love to print the legend.
Right. Well, I mean, that's the problem with even researching paranormal when you're looking at those old newspaper articles that, like the airship stuff. I mean, we know there were airship sightings, but there are some that are just like, this is just to sell papers.
Yeah, certainly. And the same with the Wildman stuff. I mean, there's so many of them that are, really? But the way I look at that, like with the Wildman reports, is like if you just look over the whole collection of them and you start finding like, okay, they're picking out these very unusual Bigfoot behaviors, climbing on roofs, their aversion to firearms. They seem to know what firearms are when people, produce them, point them at them. They freak out. They know what firearms are. They, climb on roofs, knock on windows, all this stuff. And you see it in these accounts, like across centuries. And to me, that's where it's like, okay, all right. So there's something there.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes down to like, running down the mountain, breathing fire, maybe, who knows, right? That might just certainly have been added just for effect. So that's the interest in those reports for me. And I imagine the airships are the same. You kind of look at them as like take an overview of them rather than any one particular story and see what's there of value. But yeah, the Hermit is and I think that's why it took me so long. It took me 3 years to write this book, write and illustrate it. And I think that's why it took me so long, because I wanted to do my best to do a good representation of these people and tell their stories as best as I could. And you really never know when you're done. There's another book out on Hermits that was published before mine And I think it was called Hairy Men in Caves or something like that. And this is not to insult the guy. It was an interesting book. I actually used it as a source for mine. But it seemed like for each Hermit, he kind of picked one newspaper article and just put the details in there from that newspaper article. What I tried to do was like, let me find all the articles on these guys I can, and compare and contrast, and also again with the census records and everything else, military records, and see what I can find about what's true as much as possible. It took a long time.
Yeah. That's, man. How much of the research did you find when you were on the road trip? Like what percentage do you think?
Not much, honestly.
No, okay.
That was, look, I still wrote it off because it was for the book.
Right. Yeah.
But and most of it I knew. I was just hoping to find. I was hoping to find pictures of John Smith. I thought if I went to Irving, there's an antique store in Irving, Massachusetts, where he was. I thought I was hoping to find photos of him. I did not find any. I asked at the antique store, and they didn't seem to know too much about him there, which is, it's like, man, this guy's right here, like maybe a mile away from that antique store. And they didn't really know too much about him. They'd heard about him, but beyond that, the hike to his cave, my son and I did. Another interesting little synchronicity. There was this wonderful bird that was singing the whole time we were walking there, and I actually stopped and recorded it. I love this bird song. Went and saw his cave, and my son was very patient with me. Hermits are not his thing; they're my thing. But he was very, very supportive and very good. He's a great hiking partner anyway. But I remember Allison, my wife, had called me that day, and she's like, I don't think you should do that hike. I read it's a very difficult hike. And she actually got me kind of nervous about it. Like, whoa, and Gideon's like, no, we came here to do this. We're doing it. He's just that kind of person, like very, he was very supportive. And I know I stayed a lot longer at the cave than he would have liked, but he was very patient with me. In any case, this bird, later on, I get home and I'm playing the bird for Strange Familiars listeners, and it turns out, somebody said, oh, that's a hermit thrush. A nice little synchronicity there. The hermit thrush sang me to the hermit's cave.
that sounds like a song from Stone Breath.
There you go. Yeah, maybe it will be.
So you've done some of these stories on Strange Familiars, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how do people,
half dozen or so.
How do people react to them generally?
I was surprised. So William Woodruff was the first one I did, and I thought, basically, like, I had done all this research on him, and we had done a couple like weird history shows before, mostly like circus stuff, like Allison's kind of thing, and obviously some historical Bigfoot stuff and things like that. But this was like really like not much of a paranormal element to it. Not much, like the circus at least has like the circus, the sideshow people and stuff. And there's I think a good bit of crossover there. I didn't know if this was like considered weird history. I didn't know how people were going to take to it, but I was fascinated. I was absolutely fascinated by it. And I was shocked at how much people really took to him. And some people say, I love the Hermit shows. Like, can't wait till you do another Hermit show, which really surprised me. I didn't know. I didn't know if people were going to be like, oh, don't do it. They could have not liked it, but people really, really responded well. And I was pleasantly surprised by that because, variety being the spice of life, it gives me a chance to do something different every now and then.
True. You were saying that tell the Led Zeppelin thing.
Yeah. So the fellow on the cover, he is known as Brusher Mills, and he was a snake catcher in England. He would catch adders, which were venomous, and they would hire him to catch him like at golf courses and stuff. Like if they had like too many, they would hire him, and he would catch him. He had literal snake oil that he made that he claimed would cure the adder's bite. He made it by, I think, boiling the fat of the adders himself. He lived in the forest in a little like kind of stick hut, made out of sticks and soil and sod and so forth. And up until very recently, many people believed, that he was the fellow that's on the cover of Led Zeppelin 4. So I think on that cover, it's a guy carrying a bunch of sticks on his back, I believe.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So many people believe that was Brusher Mills until very recently. I think in the past 2 years, someone discovered who that actually is on the cover. It's not Brusher Mills. But for a long time, they believed it was Brusher Mills on the cover. Interestingly enough, the gatefold of that album is the tarot card of the Hermit. Huh. That sort of famous Led Zeppelin Hermit thing that's on their t-shirts and stuff. That's on the gatefold of that same album. So interesting Hermit connection there. The Brusher Mills lived in the forest, in the New Forest woods in England over there until towards the end of his life. And then they forced him out. I think somebody burnt down his house there. And he moved to a sort of a shed out back of his favorite pub, which was called the Railway Inn at the time. that has since been named or renamed rather. It's called the Snake Catcher now in honor of Brusher Mills.
Nice.
So he's still kind of has a presence there. There's a few of the hermits have places. There's a hermit in Maine named Charles Coffin. There's a place up there called the Desert of Maine. It's not an actual desert. It was bad farming practices that basically left the land looking like a desert, up there, 40 acres or so. And at some point, in the early 1900s, somebody bought it and decided they're going to make a tourist place, and they call it the Desert of Maine. It looks like a desert surrounded by, regular deciduous trees. It's an interesting place. But Charles Coffin lived outside of that, just outside of that desert. He had a cabin he built there. He was a musician. He built I wish I could hear this. It was a combination piano organ that he played. He made it from 2 pump organs and a piano. It took him 3 years to make, and he played it. So supposedly it sounded really cool. Like people were like, "That's amazing." And he would tour the country with his piano organ and play it. But the Desert of Maine has a miniature golf course there now. It's still a tourist attraction, and I think it's called the Hermits Range or something like that. So the hermit is in the name of the miniature golf course, but they have a statue of Charles Coffin out front.
That's cool.
A little sort of cartoony statue of him there. A lot of places like they have these guys have made it through time. Like I said, the Leatherman, they have the Leatherman race. There's another guy, William Pester. And besides the Leatherman, he's probably like the second most famous guy in the book. And he's very famous there's a song that Nat King Cole wrote called Nature Boy. Nat King Cole didn't write it. Sorry, Nat King Cole made it popular. He sang it, called Nature Boy. It was also covered by Frank Sinatra, David Bowie, Miles Davis, Lady Gaga, many, many other famous musicians. And it is thought that he was the inspiration for that song. He lived in the 1920s. He looked like a hippie from the 1960s. He lived in California. He lived a sort of vegetarian life, clothing optional. There's pictures of him with a slide guitar. He's playing slide guitar in his lap. He looks like he could have come from the 1960s. And he's very, very popular. His photo postcards of him will sell for upwards of $100. What they don't tell you, though, is he, in 1940, he was arrested as what the prison records designate a quote-unquote sex pervert.
Oh.
He found himself incarcerated. He's accused of having sex with underage boys in Riverside, California. He spent 6 years in San Quentin and Folsom prisons. So, they kind of take that part of the story out. This is the legends that aren't printed. You hear about the Nature Boy thing with him, but no one ever tells you about the stint in jail.
Yeah. Obviously, a lot of the ones you took were from around the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
How many do you think were hermits due to being in the Civil War?
A few of them, for sure. They were definitely veterans, and it's obvious some of them, were married and just couldn't get along with their wives and split up, and they go to live alone. And you do wonder if it was PTSD, honestly. There was, at Chautauqua Lake, there was a hermit. They called him Left-Handed Charlie. And he was a Civil War veteran. He's the one who claimed to be a drummer boy, but was in the Navy, actually. But he had claimed to have been, out in the Wild West and all this stuff. And in Left-Handed Charlie's claims of being a cowboy got him caught telling lies. When Theodore Roosevelt, then governor of New York, came to hear the hermit stories in the late 1890s, the Forest Republican reported on June 14th, 1899. Quote, "There is probably not a small boy in this state who does not know of the governor's life in the West and of his prowess as a hunter and skill as a cowboy." So Theodore Roosevelt would have been governor of New York at this time. Mm-hmm. It was natural that the boys of Chautauqua should be greatly elated at the coming of the hero of the summer in question, and that they should lug him off to see Left-Handed Charlie, another hero of theirs who lived in a houseboat on the lake and spent most of his time telling thrilling tales of his career in the far West. Governor Roosevelt quickly turned the conversation to the West and very soon discovered that Left-Handed Charlie was a fraud. So he made up these stories about being a cowboy. He was called out by Theodore Roosevelt.
Was he the one that also had a Bigfoot encounter? Roosevelt?
No. That was William Woodruff.
Oh, Woodruff.
But, Left-Handed Charlie was a character for sure. He definitely told stories.
So how many of these hermits do you think actually were brokenhearted, and that's why they were hermits?
There are a few. Like I want to say it was probably attributed to 70% of them at least, and I'm probably 25 to 40% were actually as far as I could tell were actually sort of brokenhearted folks. So it did happen, but it became this trope where it was just applied to almost every one of them.
Well, it sells.
Yeah. It's it's sort of a sweet story. It softens them. It's not just like, this guy was hard to get along with. No,
Right. Well, so besides that, what do you think is the most misunderstood thing about hermits?
Probably that, he's just a grumpy old man or something like that, because a lot of them were very personable. They were they liked company. They just wanted to live alone, So the idea that they hated people or they were just grumps or, scary or in some ways, most of them seemed very genial and very, very accepting of visitors, very happy from them. There were a few that weren't. There were a few that definitely were very standoffish for whatever reason. Like I said, the Leatherman, he really did not talk to people. He stopped at the same houses all the time. He wouldn't stop at new houses. He wouldn't beg. He wouldn't take food or anything from people that he didn't know that hadn't given him food previously. So he really kept to himself, but he wasn't mean, He just, for whatever reason, just kept to himself. But most of these guys were, they were happy to talk to people. They were happy to have visitors. They just, for whatever reason, lived alone.
And you mentioned the one guy took a vow of silence, supposedly. Is that a common thing among hermits or no?
No, as far as I could tell, in this book, he was the only one. And I don't know if, again, that might have been a newspaper legend. He could have had a practical vow of silence, basically by his isolation, essentially caused him to have a practical vow of silence. It was, so he was the one that handed out the hollyhock flowers to people. They did note that he didn't say anything to them. He just handed them flowers when they passed by. He wouldn't say anything. So he, did he just not like to talk or did he really take a vow of silence? I do not know. He did break it at one point. He went to Winstead and asked for apple pie. Oh. He shows up in town. I think it's an 8-mile walk from his cabin to Winstead, to that town. And he asked for apple pie. So he certainly broke his vow of silence for pie, which, for apple pie, right piece of pie, I might as well.
You also said 2025 is the year of the Hermit.
It is. Now, I did not do this on purpose, and I did not declare it the year of the Hermit. So numerology speaking, 2 + 2 is 4 + 5 is 9, and that is the number of the Hermit card in the tarot. So people, not me, people have declared it the year of the Hermit. I don't know how I happened to make the timing right. I was trying to get this book out last year and the year before, and really the year before that, and it just wasn't finished until now. So somehow I've timed it to come out in the year of the Hermit.
Huh, okay. Who is it? Just because it's a numerology thing? I mean, did anyone officially determine that or something?
No, I think it's just one of the sort of internet meme kind of things where somebody said, "Yeah, it's the year of the Hermit." It's kind of cat caught on. I've heard it from multiple sources, not just me.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah. So this book has tons of photos of hermits. Besides the individual hermits, there's a whole chapter called A Hermit Miscellany, and it has just tons of other photos of hermits. Either I couldn't find their story, or at some point this book was going to be so big it would be unmanageable, and I needed to call it done. So I just made a cutoff for myself. I gave myself a deadline. And so a lot of them have sort of in the captions, the very basics of their life, if I could find anything about them, are in the captions in the miscellany chapter. There's tons of photos in there. And the illustrations in this book, I feel, are the best illustrations I've done in any of my books so far.
Really?
I'm really, really happy with the illustrations. Each chapter has a unique chapter heading I drew for that hermit. Most of them have a spot illustration at the end of the chapter, and there are quite a few full-page illustrations throughout of different hermits. So it's not just photos and it's not just writing. I think it's some of my best illustration I've done.
Do you think you'll do another book on hermits?
So right now I'm saying no, but I also said that after Where the Footprints End. I said no more. This is it, and I will go back to that subject certainly. So you never know. You never know. If I do, it may not be as intense as this one.
Right.
I would like to write a little something. It would be a very thin volume because there's just not that much on him. But I might pull out my chapter on John Stink, add a little bit to it, and some more photos of him, and sort of make a John Stink biography separate, because the other one I used is out of print and quite expensive. So there's really no biography of John Stink. So I might do something like that because, like I said, I just find his story so fascinating. I just very, very interesting.
Well, what do you have next on your project list?
So I'm hoping to knock out quite a few books this year.
Really?
Because all this time I've been working on this one, I've not stopped researching other things. So I've research done for 2 or 3 more books. I have to put them together, do a little bit more writing. I don't think I'll get them all out this year, but I'm hoping to get, let's say, more than one out in 2025. That's the hope. The podcast comes first. I have to make sure there's an episode of that out each week.
Right.
So that's the major thing. I have 2 new albums coming out this year. I guess they're going to be solo albums. I don't know. I want to call them. I want to put them out under a name of. It's actually one of the guys from one of the airship stories. His name is August Falamuth, and I just love the name so much. I always wanted to do something with it. I was like, I just want to read it, but I'm not going to hide behind it. It's obviously going to be me. But I just like the name so much. I thought I might release it under that name, or it might just be under my name. Either way, it'll be on the Stone Breath Bandcamp. But it's the Secret Heart of Hum and the Sacred Heart of Hum, 2 full albums. I've been working on that for a long time. There's a lot of things. Once I published this Hermit book, I've been able to kind of finish up. There's a couple projects I'm working on for Strange Familiars that'll be sort of documented. One is, I guess you could call it a psychic questing project, and the other is a paranormal experiment, which is going to be for the patrons can take part in. And, so there's a lot happening. A lot happening. Very, very creative time for me. Hopefully this year will be Allison's first book will come out as well, which she's been researching for far longer than I did the Hermits book. So it's well time for that to come out.
What's her book about?
Sideshow photography in York, Pennsylvania. So one of the most prolific and best sideshow photographers ever. Well, actually a couple of them were in York, Pennsylvania. York, Pennsylvania was a circus stop, so it's a lot about the photographers. It's a lot of photographs of these sideshow performers and research on the performers themselves she's done. So it's very neat. So everything first of all, she's a better writer than I am. She's a fantastic writer. And her better researcher too, really. She's her research is impeccable. So it's going to be something. I think it'll be a really, really special book. It is very, she's like, oh, it's so local focused. I said, yeah, but everyone loves the circus, and everyone loves the sideshows. Just because it happens to be photographed in York, I think it'll have a wider appeal than that.
Yeah, I think so. Do you want to give anyone a hint of what your books are?
Well, I have, so there will be more on Bigfoot.
Okay.
There will be more on some local things, some sort of local legends and so forth, which I love doing. There's going to be a book on, we'll just say creatures in Pennsylvania. I won't give away exactly what it is. Not Bigfoot. This is other things. And I'm working on a book on Toad Road.
Oh.
It's a completely different take on it. I don't even know how to explain it. It'll be very art heavy, and the writing is very, very different than anything else I've written before. It's sort of meant to be done as a spoken word performance, but it'll be a book too. I don't even know how to describe it, what it is. It's just, it's very, very, very different, very different.
So back to your roots of Toad Road.
Yeah, I was reading, it was actually in the Black Alchemist book. And in there, they had this idea that not only they're genus loci, like spirits of place, but these spirits of place pick a human to be the lore keeper for that place. And when I read that, it kind of hit me in my heart. And I was like, oh, I think that's me for Toad Road. I mean, I really think I'm that person. And it's really made me think about my relationship to it. And it's, like I said, it's a different kind of book. It's not, here's my research, here's my proof. This is here's all these connections I've made in my head, and I'm not bothering. I don't need to have a whole bibliography because these are the connections I've made. These are my experiences there. These are the experiences of other people there. And, let's just see how the threads tie together.
Nice. All right. Well, thank you for coming on and talking about this, Tim.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime.
And people will be able to find the book where? Everywhere?
Okay. So you can find it. You can pre-order it. Well, it's out now. It's out on Amazon. You can get it from Amazon if you want. You can get it from your local bookstore, order it in. Any bookstore should be able to order it. You can get it from me as well at my Etsy shop. And there's links to all of that in every show notes to every episode of Strange Familiars, or if you just go to strangefamiliars.com, you can find all that information. If you get it from me, you get a signed copy, but by all means, get it wherever you're most comfortable getting it. So it is available on Amazon now. I should have my copies in a week or so.
Which will be before this airs, so you'll have them by then.
Okay. All right. Very good. Yeah. I'm taking pre-orders, and they will ship as soon as I get them.
Do you have any of your books as audiobooks?
No, but I'm going to start doing it. I think I'm just going to offer them on Bandcamp.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Audible has very, very strict regulations about, how the audio has to sound and this and that.
Yeah.
And they want you to use they have AI voices.
Yeah.
They want you to use their AI voices, which is fine, but they don't pronounce local place names. Let's say in Beyond the Seventh Gate, I have a lot of local place names. They don't pronounce them correctly.
Yeah.
So you have to go in and then like tell them phonetically how to pronounce each one of those names. I'm not sure it's a time saver. So.
No, it's not. And that's the thing. And I mean, even when it's done well, you can still tell it's an AI.
Yeah. So really what I want to do is just sit down and just do them. And I began doing them. I think I have a better way to do it now that will make it a little bit quicker and just offer them on Bandcamp. Like, fine, Audible doesn't have them, but you know what? My music does fine on Bandcamp. I'm sure people have no problem buying audiobooks off of Bandcamp too.
Yeah, that's a great idea, actually. All right, Tim, thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I want to take a moment here to thank all of my Patreons. I can't do this without you, so thank you for supporting the show. And know that every positive thing that comes out of this show is partially because of you. I want to give a special shout out to all my patrons who are pledging $10 or more a month. Greg Ross, John Blackburn, Madeline J., Marty Garza, Matt in Delaware, Allison Cook, Super Inframan, 36 Dingo, Tim, Andrew Nichols, Matthew Sproul, Marthartha, Midnight Review Presents, Christine, a blue second-gen MR2 drifting around a Japanese mountain, Abby Allen, Patricia Gayaquinta, American Rambler, Andrew Maines, Ann Witowski, Barbara Fisher, Beverly Williamson, Billuminati, Bright Rectangle, Charles Davis, Charles in Florida, Land of the Crazy and Communicable, Corey Nelson, Diane B., MTK, Eric Citron, Eric Todd, History and Coffee, J. Otto Bullitt, Jack Huntington, James Lindsay, Jim and Sophie, John Mattingly, John Bracken, Jonathan Frost, Carla Mahoney, Kevin Shurek, Cool Kitty, Kristen L., Laser Printer Jam, Lauren McLean, Linda from Michigan, Linz Jackson K., MJ Armstrong, Mark Shoemaker, Mark Brady, Mark Smith, Paul Jeffries, Perry Peters, Philosopher of Mirrors, Riker and Stark, Ron Dupre, Sam Sharon, Sasha McHale, Schmooples, Devourer of Mortal Souls, Stacy Sherwood, Tactical Therapist, Taylor Bell, Thunderboy, Tyler Glimstead, Victoria, Vincent Treewell, Will Cherry, Will Gebhard, Will Powell, Annabelle Smith, Caroline Walker, TDT Skunkworks, Colin Karras, Craig Sagastumi, and Matthew Brown. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. All right, there's a Patreon segment to go along with this. If you're a Patreon, you will get that very soon. You can also purchase it separately at the Patreon site. You can find it through wheredidtheroadgo.com. And it's also available on Apple Podcasts. If you just want to pay for the bonus stuff on any show, it's there to do so. All right. I want to welcome a new patron this week, Alicia White. Welcome. I hope you enjoy the extra content. See you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.